50 meters. That was the insane distance between a Venezuelan military helicopter and an American destroyer right in the middle of the Caribbean. To give you an idea, 50 meters is less than a football field. Now imagine an armed military aircraft flying just 50 meters away from most lethal combat ship in the U.S. Navy. This is what experts call diplomatic suicide. The commander of the USS Jason Dunham had just seconds to decide. Was this a coordinated attack, or just the most dangerous provocation in recent U.S.-Venezuela history? The wrong answer could have sparked the first armed conflict between the two countries in over 100 years. And this didn't happen just once. In the past few days, Venezuelan F-16 fighters have repeated this insane maneuver multiple times, forcing American ships into full alert in the middle of international waters. What you're about to find out today may be the exact moment the world nearly witnessed a military catastrophe no one was prepared to face. To understand the seriousness of what happened, we need to go back a few weeks. The new Trump administration decided to drastically step up the American military presence in the Caribbean, sending 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including the USS Jason Dunham, a nuclear submarine, and more than 4,000 Marines to the region. The official justification: combating drug trafficking that uses Venezuelan maritime routes. But on the other side of the border, Nicolas Maduro saw this move completely differently. For the Venezuelan regime, this wasn't an anti-drug operation, but preparation for a possible invasion or forced regime change. The paranoia in Caracas hit levels we hadn't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Things got even more tense when, on September 2nd, U.S. forces attacked and sank a vessel suspected of carrying drugs in Caribbean waters. The incident resulted in 4 deaths. And while the United States insists the vessel was being used by drug cartels, the Venezuelan government saw the strike as clear proof that Washington was willing to use lethal force in the region. Then came what may have been Venezuela's most dangerous mistake in decades. On the morning of September 4th, 2 Venezuelan F-16 fighters, ironically, planes originally sold to Venezuela by the United States in 1980s, took off from an air base near the coast and flew directly toward the USS Jason Dunham. What happened next was described by Pentagon officials as a highly provocative show of force. The 2 armed F-16s flew low over the American destroyer, passing just meters above the ship. To grasp how serious this was, we're talking about fully armed combat jets flying over one of the deadliest warships in the world. The commander of the USS Jason Dunham had to decide within seconds: interpret the move as an imminent attack or as a political provocation. Luckily for everyone, he chose the second option. But that wasn't the end of it. The next day, September 5th, Venezuelan aircraft repeated the maneuver, this time including military helicopters that also flew dangerously close to the American ship. The American reaction was direct. The Pentagon released an official statement labeling the Venezuelan actions highly provocative and a clear attempt to interfere with counterterrorism and counter-narcotics operations. But the most significant response came directly from President Trump. In a decision that drastically raised the stakes, Trump authorized American naval commanders to shoot down any Venezuelan aircraft that posed a direct threat to U.S. ships. That means, for the first time in decades, U.S. pilots now have authorization to down fighter jets from a South American country. The last time something like this happened was during conflicts in Central America. In the 1980s, Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense, who is now using the historic title Secretary of Conflicts, was even more blunt in his statements. He made it clear that any new provocation would be met with all measures necessary to protect American personnel and equipment. Maduro's response to the American threat was even more dramatic and, frankly, terrifying. On the night of September 11th, a symbolically chosen date marking exactly 24 years since the Twin Towers attacks, the Venezuelan dictator appeared on state television in full military combat uniform, beret on his head, surrounded by armed forces generals, to announce what he called Independence Plan 200, active resistance and permanent offense. Just look at the scale of what Maduro set in motion. 284 battlefronts spread across Venezuelan territory, mobilizing not only 25,000 soldiers from the Bolivarian National Armed Forces, but also the entire Bolivarian National Militia and the so-called Combat Corps. To understand what this means, Maduro turned every state, every municipality, every oil refinery, every airport, and every kilometer of Venezuela's border into an active military zone. The most impressive part is how this mobilization was geographically organized. Maduro made it clear that the 284 fronts covered from north to south and from east to west, from the Caribbean coasts to the Colombian border, the Andes, the east, and the south of the country. That means there isn't a single centimeter of Venezuelan territory not under direct military control at this moment. During the 45-minute address, Maduro used language that international analysts consider the most aggressive and militaristic since he came to power in 2013. He stated verbatim, "Venezuela has always been willing to talk, to negotiate, but we demand respect. We are currently in a political phase, but if Venezuela is attacked in any way, we will move into a phase of armed struggle." But the statement that most caught experts' attention was when Maduro directly warned President Trump that any U.S. military action against Venezuela would stain his hands with blood. He even said the American government was carrying out the greatest military threat against Venezuela in the last 100 years. The apocalyptic tone peaked when Maduro declared he was prepared to turn Venezuela into a nation in arms if American forces attacked Venezuelan territory. These are exactly the kinds of words authoritarian leaders use when preparing to resist at all costs, even if it means dragging their own people into a devastating conflict. There's a detail that makes this even more concerning. Maduro announced a campaign to recruit 8 million Venezuelans, practically one-third of the country's population, for what he called national resistance. We're talking about a mass civilian militarization program unprecedented in recent Latin American history. But to truly understand how serious this was, I spoke with experts in naval conflict and military aviation. The consensus was unanimous. The Venezuelan maneuvers were extremely dangerous and could easily have resulted in an accident with catastrophic consequences. First, the technical side. The USS Jason Dunham is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer equipped with the Aegis combat system, capable of tracking and engaging multiple targets simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers. When two armed F-16s approach in an uncoordinated way, the ship's automated systems interpret it as a possible threat. In situations like this, the difference between a diplomatic incident and an armed conflict can be measured in seconds. A miscommunication, a mechanical failure in either aircraft, or even a wrong interpretation of intentions could have resulted in the first downing of military planes between the U.S. and Venezuela. The second worrying aspect is the historical precedent. Similar incidents in the past, like the Korean Air Flight 007 case in 1983 or the Taiwan Strait tensions, show how uncoordinated military flyovers can quickly escalate into direct confrontations. But this crisis goes far beyond a single naval incident. In reality, we're seeing the culmination of years of deteriorating relations between Washington and Caracas, worsened by political instability in Latin America and the growing influence of rival powers in the region. Venezuela, diplomatically isolated and economically devastated, sees this escalation as an opportunity to consolidate internal support around the narrative of resisting imperialism. Maduro knows external conflicts historically strengthen authoritarian regimes by creating a common enemy and justifying internal repression. On the American side, the new Trump administration has clearly chosen a much tougher line on Latin America than its predecessors. The decision to send 4,000 Marines to the Caribbean is the biggest show of American military force in the region since the invasion of Panama in 1989. But there's a factor making this crisis even more complex: the presence of U.S. rival powers in the region. Russia maintains military advisors in Venezuela and recently supplied the country with air defense systems. China, meanwhile, is Venezuela's largest creditor and has billions invested in oil infrastructure. That means any conflict between the U.S. and Venezuela wouldn't be an isolated showdown, but potentially the first clash between great powers in Latin America since the Sandinista Revolution. The risk of escalation into a global dimension conflict, while still remote, is real. Based on analysis of similar conflicts and the latest statements from both sides, we can identify three main scenarios. For the next few weeks, Scenario 1, diplomatic de-escalation. The most likely outcome is still that both sides will step back from the warlike rhetoric. Maduro got what he wanted, showing strength to his domestic audience and consolidating the resistance narrative. Trump, for his part, showed he won't tolerate provocations. Informal diplomatic channels, probably through third parties like Brazil or Colombia, could help create a tacit understanding to reduce tensions. Scenario 2, controlled escalation. An intermediate scenario would involve a series of smaller incidents, more flyovers, ship interceptions, showy military exercises, keeping tensions high without crossing the red line of direct confrontation. This would serve both sides' political interests, but would greatly increase the risk of accidents. Scenario 3, limited conflict. The most dangerous scenario, though less likely, would be escalation into limited military conflict. This could begin with the downing of a Venezuelan aircraft perceived as a threat by the U.S., followed by Venezuelan retaliation against American ships or installations in the region. Behind all this geopolitics, we can't forget the real people who will be affected by any escalation. Venezuela is already living through one of the worst humanitarian crises in the Western Hemisphere, with more than 7 million Venezuelans having left the country in recent years. Any worsening of the security situation could trigger a new wave of migration that would affect all of Latin America. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, already hosting millions of Venezuelan refugees, simply don't have the capacity to absorb more. For the whole of Latin America, this escalation is the perfect storm at the worst possible time. We already have more than 7.7 million Venezuelans spread across the region, one of the biggest migration crises in modern continental history. Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile are hosting 70% of these refugees, and their systems are already maxed out. Any military escalation will multiply this humanitarian crisis tenfold. Colombia, which already took in nearly 3 million Venezuelans, simply doesn't have the capacity to absorb another massive wave of refugees fleeing armed conflict. Peru and Ecuador, which already face the biggest humanitarian burdens, would also collapse. But the impacts go way beyond migration. American naval forces are already making South American countries uneasy, as they see this as a possible precursor to intervention. Brazilian President Lula was blunt. U.S. warships in the Caribbean are a source of tension for the entire region. The reality is that we're seeing the ghost of the Cold War rise again in Latin America. Maduro is invoking the bloody history of American interference in the region, and that resonates deeply in countries that lived through decades of instability caused by outside interventions. In recent weeks, Latin America as a whole has been witnessing the most serious regional security crisis since the Falklands War in 1982. The difference now is that we have a global power with 4,500 troops actively positioned for potential conflict right in our backyard, while the region faces the largest migration crisis in its history. The scariest part is that this isn't just a bilateral crisis between the U.S. and Venezuela. China has huge investments in Venezuela and profits economically from the relationship, while Russia keeps providing military support and equipment to Caracas. We are literally watching the setup for a superpower clash in our region. Past crises teach us that incidents like the Venezuelan F-16 flyovers rarely happen in a vacuum. They usually come as the result of gradual escalation, reaching a point of no return. The closest parallel might be the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when American spy plane flyovers nearly led to nuclear confrontation. The difference back then was that direct communication channels existed between Washington and Moscow. Today, there are practically no functioning diplomatic channels between the U.S. and Venezuela. One worrying aspect of this crisis is how it's being portrayed by the media in both countries. In Venezuela, state media presents the flyovers as heroic defensive operations against imperialist aggressors. In the United States, the very same incidents are described as unacceptable provocations by an authoritarian regime. This polarized narrative makes it even harder to find diplomatic solutions, since both sides are stuck in incompatible versions of reality. In past conflicts, independent international media helped moderate extreme positions. Today, social media and recommendation algorithms tend to amplify the most dramatic takes. What happened in the Caribbean in recent days wasn't an isolated incident, but the result of years of built-up tensions now reaching a critical point. The Venezuelan pilot's decision to fly over armed American ships was, at best, extremely reckless. At worst, it was a calculated provocation that could have resulted in the first combat deaths between U.S. and Venezuelan forces. What worries me most isn't what has already happened, but what might happen next. With 25,000 Venezuelan troops mobilized, American ships patrolling Caribbean waters, and both leaders using increasingly warlike language, we are literally one accident away from a conflict nobody really wants, but that could be nearly impossible to stop once it begins. The big question is, does diplomacy still have room to prevent the worst-case scenario? Or have we already passed the point where minor incidents can escalate into something much bigger? One thing is certain: the coming days will be crucial to determine whether we're just seeing another chapter in the long history of U.S.-Venezuela tensions, or if we're witnessing the prelude to the first significant military conflict in Latin America in the 21st century.